Meantime, the cost of Obamacare for enrollees is going up again. People who live in so-called swing states are looking at double-digit premium increases. Wisconsin, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, just in time for the November election. And they will have fewer insurers from which to choose. Joining me now from Tampa, Florida, founder and CEO of Rotella Legal Group, Bryan Rotella. Bryan, Obamacare is imploding. The system is overloaded, let's face it. These people who are not healthy are pouring into the system. These insurers have to, by law, accept them. And so these insurers are getting overwhelmed. They're losing money, and they have two choices. And that is jack up the rates or leave the system.
Hi, Graham. That's absolutely accurate. What's really the issue here, I said this yesterday, you mentioned Aetna in the lead into this. Aetna is the Lehman Brothers of Obamacare. Aetna pulling out of 17 markets is a dramatic and significant move in the trajectory of Obamacare. What I mean by that, Graham, is Aetna was the linchpin behind all of the private insurers that were going to be able to keep Obamacare alive and well. It's not well. Guess why? Its patients aren't well. The ultimate flaw that was in Obamacare from the beginning was the fact that they were the framers of it, whether they did it willfully or just, let's call it legislative malpractice, thought that you could rate folks who are sick the same as you could rate folks for insurance that are healthy. You can't do that with cars, Graham. You can't do it with healthcare.
Right, so let's back up a little bit. Aetna sustained a $200 million loss in the second quarter. No company can survive something like that. But when you talk about risk, insurance, and insurance guys will tell you this, insurance is all about risk, judging risk, mitigating risk, paying risk, not paying on risk. But there has to be risk adjustment within the market. That's what you're talking about here, right? And so what the federal government has created here is an artificial system.
That's right, Graham. They're puffing up. The government puffed up the risk. What I mean by that is there were subsidies that were put in place. Not to bore your viewers, but there was all this different stuff they put in, including a nonprofit type of entity called a co-op. And all of these were supposed to mitigate those risks that the insurance companies were taking. And it was being done at the cost of the taxpayers to the tune of billions of dollars. But what wasn't avoided and couldn't be avoided was the fact that you had a bunch of folks with a bunch of healthcare conditions who, for the first time, to the tune of over 10.2 or 11 million, close to 11 million people, joined these exchanges, and most of them were sick. And as these premiums are going up, the healthy folks, you know what they're doing? I have an office full of and a team full at Rotella Legal Group of wonderful millennial lawyers. They're choosing not to go out and get insurance. They're choosing to take the $700 penalty every year because that's a better risk to them than going out and paying for one of these really high premium plans, especially here in Florida where it's 40% premium increase.
It's a better risk. And it's cheaper, let's face it. I mean, this is part of the system that they built, that these geniuses in Washington, D.C. built. But when you talk about, just very briefly, when you talk about Aetna being the linchpin, if you will, in this whole system, are you suggesting that other dominoes will fall? We know that Humana and a couple others have dropped out. And those co-ops you mentioned, half of them have died, and the rest are built on a model that's not going to work. What are you predicting here based on Aetna exiting so many of these states?
Well, Graham, actually, it's more than half. It's 3/4 of those co-ops have failed. And the reason Aetna's the linchpin is one company you didn't mention is United. United has said that they're backing out, and that was about 2 months ago. The reason Aetna is ultimately the linchpin to this, though, is an article that I wrote in my role as a contributor for The Hill called The Big Obamacare Bubble. And for those folks in your audience who saw The Big Short, the mortgage industry faced this with the risks that they had. And what did we see? When was there a bank that was too big to fail, that was too big that needed to be propped up by the government? That's the situation with Aetna falling. And that's why literally last night, you saw tweets from Donald Trump, John McCain, from Speaker Ryan, from pretty much everybody in the Republican Party, and quite frankly, from folks in the Democratic Party, all saying this is a major issue and they're seeing the dominoes fall.
Okay, so let's peer into the future here. I see this happening. I see the choices shrinking, these co-ops eventually dying out. It's going to come down to one or two major insurers in the Obamacare system. And at some point, these geniuses in Washington, D.C., especially if Hillary is elected, they're going to declare maybe a health emergency, and they're going to nationalize these remaining healthcare systems. And then that is the first step towards single payer. You see something like that happening?
Graham, you're prophetic, but you're also listening to the former Secretary of State's speeches over the last couple of weeks and the president's. Public option, public option. For your audience, and you know this, Graham, what's public option code word for? It's the first step to universal payer. And if I had a lot of time on my hands back in 2011 when I was starting my business, Rotella Legal Group, and I actually read the Affordable Care Act. Yeah. And let me tell you, when I read it, the first thing that I saw in it was the legislative history, which was that the public option was what they wanted, and it was pulled out at the last minute. The reason they want a public option is that lets a government-run entity set and cap rates. No private company can compete against that. It's ultimately going to fold into a public payer system. And for your audience, the question I would ask is, if you are currently with the VA system or with Medicaid, do you like that system? Because if you do, that's what a public option will look like.
Yeah, I think that the answer is a resounding no for most people. And November 1st, by the way, is the beginning of open enrollment again. That's about a week before the November election. We'll see if the American people are smart enough to connect the dots. Bryan, thanks.